Throughout time, people across the world told each other tales of how they came to be, of heroes and monsters, romance and tragedy, death and rebirth. Mythology helped shape the ancient world, explaining the unexplainable. This is Mythology Unleashed.
Themes of good and evil, battling for domination, have long been integral to storytelling, perhaps since the very beginning. Often the idea is portrayed with external forces fighting with each other, such as hero versus villain, or man against monster. But just as common is the internal struggle of a character, where they must grapple the darkness within them, and either rise above their personal demons, or ultimately be destroyed by them. In modern fiction, perhaps no other story more perfectly demonstrates the concepts of good against evil, both internal and external, as the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. A classic horror thriller centering on the plight of venerable scientist Dr. Henry Jekyll, whose scientific experiments literally turn him into a monster, the nefarious Edward Hyde. The story of Jekyll and Hyde has gone on to become one of the most famous stories of all time, and it all came from the genius mind of author Robert Louis Stevenson. Born Robert Louis Balfour Stevenson on November 13, 1850, in Edinburgh, Scotland, Stevenson was the son of lighthouse engineer Thomas Stevenson and Isabella Balfour. As lighthouses and engineering were a multi-generational trade for his family, it was expected that he would also go into the family business, and at age 17 enrolled into Edinburgh University to study engineering, and later law. But Stevenson's heart belonged on the printed page, and after having passed advocate in 1875, Stevenson went on to write and publish a plethora of romance and adventure novels, short stories, poetry, plays, and travel writings, and became a celebrated author in his own time. Having written some of fiction's most compelling works, such as Treasure Island and Kidnapped, a magazine publisher by the name of Charles Longman requested a ghost story from Stevenson, a horror thriller that would leave the reader with a case of goosebumps. So Stevenson set his mind to the task of creating the prompted horror tale, and came up with The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Stevenson had no shortage of influences when it came to writing his horror piece. From the stories he grew up reading, to events that transpired in his waking life, to the lion's share of imagination that he possessed. In some accounts, it is claimed that Stevenson drew inspiration from his friendship with Eugene Chantrelle. Much like Jekyll, Chantrelle appeared to lead a normal life as a French teacher with his wife and former pupil, Elizabeth Dyer. In August of 1877, he took out a £1,000 life insurance policy against his wife's accidental death. Dyer was found unconscious on the morning of January 2, 1878, and later died in the hospital with traces of opium found on her nightgown. The death was suspected to be criminal in nature, and Chantrelle was tried and convicted of murder by poison, and sentenced to death by hanging. Stevenson was present throughout the trial, and noted that, as the evidence unfolded, he found himself, like Dr. Jekyll, aghast before the acts of Edward Hyde. It was believed that Chantrelle had committed other murders, both in France and Britain, by poisoning his victims at dinner parties, all the while leading an unassuming life. Another proposed inspiration was 18th century criminal Deacon William Brodie, a Scottish cabinet maker, Edinburgh city councillor, and deacon of the Trades Guild, who led a secret life of heavy drinking, gambling, cockfighting, partying, and cheating on his wife. Furthermore, he was a notorious nocturnal burglar, obscuring his face and utilizing his work as a locksmith to break into houses, robbing friends and acquaintances as well as his clients. When he was finally captured, Brody took the stand at his trial as the well-mannered, upstanding gentleman he portrayed in his daily life. When confronted with the details of his crimes, he simply smiled as if he had been an indifferent spectator, something that chilled even the most steadfast of lawmen. But respected figures who led double lives as criminals were not the only purported sources of inspiration for the strange case. In 1882, a man named Louis-Auguste Vivet was reported to be the first person to be officially diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, or DID for short. Those afflicted with DID are said to have two or more distinct or split identities or personality states that continually have power over the person's behavior. In the case of Vivet, it was reported that he had experienced mental episodes that drastically changed his personality from docile to dangerous. No doubt Stevenson would have heard of this landmark case in medical science, and it is logical to assume that he would incorporate elements of the report into his story, namely Jekyll's switching back and forth between his own personality and that of Hyde's. Despite these potential sources of inspiration, it is said by those who were closest to him that the idea for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde came to Stevenson in a way that some of the scariest stories of all time have been created: nightmares. As the story goes, Stevenson's wife, Fanny, was awoken as her husband cried out in the night while having a fitful nightmare. She woke him, only to be met with discontent, as the author claimed that he was dreaming a fine bogey tale of an evil shapeshifter, and had not wished to be disturbed. He immediately took to writing his tale based on the nightmare, and with constructive criticism from his wife, succeeded in writing the novel in the course of only a few days, finally publishing in 1886. Much like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the story of Jekyll and Hyde features little to no pre-existing fantasy elements, such as magic, monstrous beasts, or the appearance of supernatural figures. Rather, the fantasy elements come later as a result of human error. The sole supernatural aspect within the story is one found in practically every culture's mythology and folklore: shapeshifting. Shapeshifting comes in a variety of forms, so to speak, and is often the power associated with mischief makers, cunning tricksters, and evil beings. In Greek mythology, Zeus, the king of the Olympian gods, took on a number of different forms, such as a mortal man, a shower of gold, a bull, a swan, or an eagle, sometimes to divine information, to influence a series of events in the human world, or simply to seduce mortal women. Various beings in Norse mythology, namely the trickster god Loki, have the power to shapeshift into other beings, animals, or inanimate objects, sometimes to avoid detection, or to escape or defeat an enemy, or in Loki's case, to have fun at the expense of another. Various figures of Chinese legend, such as Sun Wukong, Bai Su Jian, or any of the Dragon Kings, could morph into practically anything, such as human form to find love or toy with mortals, or even into a raging torrent to battle their opponents. Navajo mythology tells of evil magic users called skinwalkers, who can assume the form of animals, and even possess people who look them in the eyes. Medieval Europe had stories of werewolves, people who were cursed to transform into bloodthirsty wolves and slaughter any who crossed their paths. But whereas these and other shapeshifters in folklore gain their powers as a result of sorcery or other supernatural means, the shapeshifting in Stevenson's novel is a result of scientific experimentation, as Jekyll brews and ingests a chemical compound with the intent to isolate, and perhaps even cure, his evil side, which subsequently transforms him into the hideous Hyde. While many artistic depictions give him a humanoid yet monstrous appearance, akin to a goblin or an ogre of European folklore, it should be noted that Hyde is never given a fully detailed description in the book, aside from being considered grotesque in appearance, more so than any other human could be, as well as unusually strong and agile, and somewhat younger looking than Jekyll. What's more is that Jekyll's transformation into Hyde appears to be extremely painful to endure, and equally horrifying to witness, not unlike a werewolf's metamorphosis or a demonic possession. Though Hyde is not as overtly monstrous as some of the abominations of ancient myth, or even as drastic as other literary monsters such as Dracula or Frankenstein's creation, Hyde, nevertheless, effortlessly conveys a sense of dread and disgust in all who look upon him. A true demon, if ever there was one. The story begins with an upstanding and staunch attorney named Gabriel John Utterson and his cousin Richard Enfield approaching a rundown house in London and discussing a chilling matter that Enfield had witnessed firsthand. Months prior, in the witching hour of the night, Enfield saw a young girl get trampled by a gruesome and wild-looking man, none other than Edward Hyde. By this time, Hyde had developed an abhorrent reputation amidst the London underground, making the skins of even the hardest of ruffians crawl. Witnesses to Hyde's cruelty to the girl, including the girl's parents and Enfield himself, demand Hyde to pay the girl's family £100 in order to avoid a scandal. Hyde then brought Enfield to the door of this dilapidated house and gave him a bank check signed by Dr. Henry Jekyll. Concerns are raised, as Jekyll has a reputation for being an honorable gentleman, a model citizen, and moreover, is Utterson's client and personal friend. The plot thickens when Utterson reveals that Jekyll had recently changed his will to make Hyde his sole beneficiary in the event of Jekyll's death or disappearance. When Utterson attempts to discuss the matter with Jekyll, Jekyll dismisses it, claiming that he can get rid of Hyde at any time, leading Utterson to hypothesize that Hyde is blackmailing Jekyll, extorting him for money and power. The question is, why? Though this story is famed for its influence on horror fiction, it was also profoundly influential in mystery stories, even predating Conan Doyle's stories of Sherlock Holmes. What we see in these early chapters are quintessential elements of a mystery story. An ominous and unsettling atmosphere, a sinister crime, a mysterious villain figure, questions to be answered, and more than a few engaging hooks. The following October, Hyde is seen once again, this time assaulting another of Utterson's clients, Sir Danvers Carew, ruthlessly bludgeoning him with a heavy cane until the cane snaps in two and the man lay lifeless upon the ground, leaving behind a fragment of the broken cane as he made his escape. Utterson leads officers of Scotland Yard to Hyde's apartment, with the scoundrel nowhere to be found. Upon investigation, they find the other half of the broken cane, and Utterson recognizes it as one he had given to Jekyll as a gift. Utterson visits Jekyll for answers regarding this condemning evidence, and the latter produces an alibi, a note allegedly written to Jekyll by Hyde, apologizing for his crimes. But upon closer inspection, Hyde's handwriting is nigh identical to that of Jekyll's, leading Utterson to surmise that Jekyll forged the note to protect Hyde. Over the following months, Jekyll appears to have returned to his former cordial and extroverted self, but by January, he becomes uncharacteristically reclusive, refusing all visitors and alarming those in his inner circles, perhaps especially Dr. Hesty Lanyon, a mutual associate of Jekyll and Utterson. Upon learning of Jekyll's condition, Lanyon experiences shock and gives Utterson a letter to be opened after Jekyll's death or disappearance, before succumbing to his failing heart. Matters with Jekyll become ever more alarming, as weeks later, Utterson and Enfield begin a conversation with Jekyll at his laboratory window, when suddenly, Jekyll slams the window shut and disappears. A recurring element in monster stories of mythology and folklore that is also present here is the creature's indirect effects on human beings and the world as a whole. Many monsters of Western folklore, such as demons, vampires, ogres, are harbingers of doom, omens of bad luck that bring about misfortune, poison the land and water, cause nightmares and illness, tear apart the mind until there is nothing left but a hollow shell. The very presence of a monster can be as dreadful as their claws and fangs. In addition to Mr. Hyde's fair share of harming and killing innocents with no remorse, his very presence, even mentioning his name, has dire effects on the world about him, much like the demons and beasts of legend. Upon learning from Jekyll's butler that the good doctor had secluded himself in his laboratory for weeks, the men break into the laboratory, and they find Hyde's lifeless body wearing Jekyll's clothing. By the clues at the scene, it is deduced that the cause of death was suicide, but a myriad of other questions arise, namely, just how were Jekyll and Hyde connected? Utterson reads Lanyon's letter, which reveals his deterioration in health came from witnessing Hyde drink an elixir that turned him into Jekyll. Utterson then reads a letter addressed to him from Jekyll, which goes on to explain his dilemma of maintaining strict moral standards publicly, but indulging in vices behind closed doors. So the doctor found a way to transform himself into a different person, and thereby indulge his vices without fear of detection. Jekyll developed an elixir that transformed his body and his mind into Hyde, a self-indulgent, apathetic, and downright evil being. While Jekyll maintained control of the transformations with the elixir, one summer night, he had transformed involuntarily in his sleep. Terrified of losing control and even losing himself, Jekyll resolved to cease becoming Hyde, but one night, when he had a moment of weakness, Jekyll drank the elixir and became Hyde once again. Having been caged within the dull prison of Jekyll for so long, Hyde, like a rabid animal, cut loose with a night of debauchery, culminating in him killing Carew. Horrified of what his darker half had done, Jekyll tried harder and harder to stop the transformations, but began to transform involuntarily, even while awake. Desperate to avoid capture, Hyde wrote to Lanyon in Jekyll's hand, requesting a specific combination of chemicals. In Lanyon's presence, Hyde mixed the chemicals, drank the serum, and transformed into Jekyll, which then instigated Lanyon's deterioration and death. Jekyll's involuntary transformations increased in frequency, and required larger and larger doses of the elixir to reverse. Eventually, chemical supplies ran low, and subsequent batches proved ineffective at containing Hyde. The monster was growing stronger and stronger. Fearing that he would remain transformed as Hyde permanently, Jekyll wrote out a full account of the event, and confessed that he was uncertain whether Hyde would face execution or end his own life. But it no longer mattered to him either way. Jekyll would soon be no more, and whatever fate awaits would be Hyde's alone to endure. More than a century later, Robert Louis Stevenson's horror thriller, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, remains one of the most influential works of fiction of all time. Influenced by events both historical and personal, mythical stories of monsters, shapeshifters, demonic influence, and curses, and a notably frightening nightmare, Stevenson succeeded in weaving a masterful story that tackled themes of good versus evil, humanity's inner savagery, self-indulgence, addiction, societal pitfalls, psychological warfare, crime and punishment, and more. Since its publication in 1886, the story of Jekyll and Hyde has been adapted into countless plays, films, radio shows, and more, while elements of The Strange Case have gone on to influence characters and stories of every fictional medium. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a cornerstone story in both the horror and mystery genres, chilling readers ever since, and shining a light on the inner darkness lurking within us all.